Hi, boys and girls. Hope you're enjoying some of this absolutely beautiful weather. Right now, we're going to finish up Julie of the Wolves. So the recording for the page numbers for the old book are 151 to 170, and for the new book, it's 178 to 200. This is your Wednesday reading, and certainly feel free to read ahead if you have the time. And here we go. Okay. Quite a bit has happened up to this point. Um, so let's see what's going to happen with Miak. She's wondering that herself. One night, while Miak sewed a boot, Kapu licked her ear and trotted off. Then he did not come back by the time the mood had swung all the way around her tent and was back again. A whole day. She went out to look for him. The snow glowed blue and green and the constellations glittered, not only in the sky, but on the ice in the river and on the snow on the bushes and trees. There was, however, no sign of Kapu. She was about to go to bed when the horizon quivered and she saw her pack the bank, running the bank. Kapu was in the lead. She crawled into her tent and awakened Tornate. Kapu's leading the hunt. All's well, she said, and now we must leave them. At dawn, she hastily took down her tent, hoisted her pack to her back, and stepped onto the frozen river where walking was the easiest. Many miles along her way, she came upon wolverine tracks and followed them up to a den. There, as she suspected, lay several rabbits and ptarmigan. She loaded them on her sled and returned to the river, listening to Tornate peep, soft plover songs, and the warmth of her parka hood. She kissed his beak gently. They were helping each other. She kept him warm and fed him, and he radiated heat in her hood. But more important, his whisperings kept her from being totally and hopelessly lonely without Kapu and her pack. With every mile she traveled now, the oil drums became more and more numerous, and the tracks of the wolverine more and more scarce. Like the wolf, the wolverine is an animal of the wilderness, and when Miak saw no more tracks, she knew she was approaching man. One night, she counted 50 oil drums on the spit in the river, and there she made camp. She must stop and think about what she wanted to do. When she thought of San Francisco, she thought about the airplane and the fire and the blood and the flashes and death. When she took out her needle and sewed, she thought about peace and Amarok. She knew what she had to do: live like an Eskimo, hunt and carve and be with Tornate. The next day she took out her man's knife and cut blocks of snow. These she stacked and shaped into a house that was generously large. If she was going to live as an Eskimo once lived, she needed a home, not just a camp. When her ice house was completed and her skins were spread over the floor, she sat down and took out the totem of Amarok. His fingers had rubbed to such a soft glow in her pocket, and he looked rich and regal. Placing him over her door, she blew him a kiss, and as she did so, happiness welled up in her. She knew he was taking care of her spirit. Time passed, fountains of the magnetic northern light came and went, and the moon waxed and waned many times. Miak found her life very satisfying. She became an expert at catching small game, and she took great pleasure in carving. When she had finished the carving of the puppies, she found a stone by the river and began chipping it into an owl. Once she listened for her pack, but they did not call. She was both glad and miserable. Miak was not Miak was not without things to do. When she was not hunting or carving, she danced, sewed, chopped wood, or made candles. Sometimes she tried to spell Eskimo words with the English alphabet. Such beautiful words must be preserved forever. One night, she she began a tiny coat of ptarmigan feathers for Tornate. He had been shivering lately, even in her parka, and she was concerned about him. She stitched the plumes into a thick, paper-thin rabbit hide and fashioned a little bird-like coat. On the moonrise, when the coat was finished and she was trying to slip it on Tornate, she heard in the distance the crackle of feet on the ice. The sound grew louder, and she poked her head into the night to see a man on the river beside his sled and team of dogs. Her heart leaped. An Eskimo hunter, one of her own pack truly. Rushing onto the river ice, she waited until the sled drew close. "Aye," she called. "Aye," a voice answered, and within minutes the hunter pulled the sled up beside her and greeted her warmly. Nestled in the furs was the man's woman and child. Their eyes glistened softly in the moonlight. Miax's voice was hoarse from disuse, but she managed to greet them happily in Eskimo and invite them into her house to sleep. The woman was glad to stop, she told Miax in the Upik dialect as she climbed from the sled. They had not rested since they left Kangeek, a town on Kuk Bay at the mouth of the Avalik River, the river they were now on. At last, Miax knew where she was. Kangeek was inland from Wainwright, and still many sleeps from Point Barrow, but she no longer cared. Miax smiled at him as if she did not understand, but put a twisted spruce log on the fire. When it was blazed and the man and his woman were warming their backs, Roland asked her again, but this time in Upik, her own beautiful tongue. She answered she answered that she was. "I'm Alice," the pretty mother said. Miax turned hopelessly. "Uma," the woman said, pointing to herself. "Atik," she said, pointing to the man lifting the baby above her and called him Sorkak. Miax found the name so nice that she took her cooking pot from the fire to offer her guests hot ptarmigan. She hummed and sang. Then she went to her sleeping skin, picked up Tornate, and held him for Sorkak, who was now on his mother's back in her kuspuk. He peeked over her shoulder, laughed at the bird, kicked, and disappeared. In his excitement, he had lost his knee grip and dropped down to his mother's belt. Miax laughed out aloud. Ulma giggled and gave her a boost. His round, his round face reappeared, and he reached for the bird. Uma and Atik are their Upik names. Miax suddenly wanted to talk. Speaking rapidly in Eskimo, she told her guests about the river, the game, the fuel, and the stars, but not about the wolves of her past. They listened and smiled. When dinner was over, Atik slowly, softly, and Miax learned that Kangeek was an Eskimo village with an airport and a mission school. A generator had been built, and electricity lighted the houses in the winter. A few men even owned snowmobiles there. Atik was proud of his town. Before going to bed, he went to feed the dogs. Then Uma talked. She said they were headed for mountains to hunt caribou. When Atik returned, Miax told him he didn't have to go to the mountains, that a large herd was yarded not far up the river. She drew a map on the floor and showed him where the wintering grounds of the caribou lay. He was happy to hear this, he said, for the Brooks Range was treacherous in the winter, with mountain slides avalanched and storms brewed up in mere minutes. Uma nursed the baby, tucked him into their furs, and softly sang him to sleep as the fire began to die down. Presently, her, presently, her head nodded and she slipped into bed where Atik joined her. Miax alone was awake and visions of Kangik filling her head. She would go there and be useful. Perhaps she could teach children how to snare rabbits, make parkas, and carve, or she might live with some family that needed her help. She might even work in the store. And Kangik, she would live as her ancestors had lived, in rhythm with the animals and the climate. She would stay far away from San Francisco, where men were taught to kill without reason. She did not fall asleep for hours. Tornado woke first and called softly. Miax dressed, cut off a piece of meat, and held it out to him. He snatched the food and swallowed it noisily. That awoke the baby, and the baby awoke Uma, who reached out, took him to her breast, and rocked him as he lay in the furry warmth of his skins. It was almost 0 in the house, and she did not hurry to get up. Atik woke, yawned, and roared, "I'm hungry." Uma laughed, and Miax put the pot on the fire. Atik dressed, went out to his sled, and brought back bacon, bread, beans, and butter. Miax had forgotten that there were such good things, and her mouth fairly watered as she smelled them cooking. At first she refused the food when Uma offered it, but seeing how disappointed she was, accepted the bacon and sucked on it quietly, remembering with pain the tastes of Barrow. After breakfast, Atik went out to harness the dogs. Miax cleaned up, and Uma chatted happily about her love for Atik and how excited she had been when he decided to take her on the hunt. Most Eskimo wives were left home these days with the advent of gusak, frozen foods. Cooks were no longer needed for the hunt, and the women never tanned hides anymore. All skins for the tourists must go to Seattle to be tanned correctly for the temperate climates where most were shipped. Ulmus rambled on. Atik had been raised in Anchorage, and he knew very little about hunting, for his father had been a mechanic. But he had died, and Atik was sent to live with his grandfather in Kangik. He had become enamored of hunting and fishing and became so skilled that when his grandfather died, he was adopted by the greatest of all living Eskimo hunters. Capuchin taught Atik where the seals live and how to smell a caribou trail. Miak stopped cleaning her pot. Her blood raced hot, then cold. Turning slowly around, she stared at Uma. "Where was this Capuchin born?" she asked in Eskimo. "He has never said. He paddled up the river one day, beached his kayak, and built a house where he landed. All I know is that he came out of the Bering Sea. But he was wealthy in the Eskimo sense, intelligence, fearless, full of love, and he soon became a leader of Kangik." Miax did not take her eyes off Uma's lips as they formed soft words of Capuchin. "Iyayai Kangik?" she asked. "Yes, but not in the center of town where the rich men live. Although Capuchin is also rich, he lives in a simple green house on the river bank. It is upstream beside the wilderness, where the people he loves feel free to visit." Trembling with eagerness, Miax asked Uma to tell her more about Capuchin, and Uma, spilling over with enthusiasm, told her how the town and its people had grown poor and hungry several years ago. The walrus had all but vanished from the coast, the gray whales were rare, and the seals were few and far between. The Bureau of Indian Affairs put most everyone on pensions, and so they drank and forgot all they knew. Then Capuchin arrived. He was full of pride and held his head high. He went out into the wilderness and came back with musk oxen. These he bred and raised. The men helped him. The women made the fur into threads then into mittens and beautiful sweaters and scarves. They were sold to the Gusaks, who paid high prices for them, and within a few years the people of Kangeek became independent and prosperous. But there's still a need for caribou and wolverine furs for clothing and trim, she said. So Capuchin and Atik go hunting every winter to supply the town. Capuchin did not come this year, she went on. He let me come instead. She smiled, slipped her baby into her kuspuk, tightened her belt, and stood up. Capuchin is wise and strong. Miax turned her back to Uma. She must not see the quivering of her body at every mention of her father's name. He had been dead to her for so long that she was almost frightened by the knowledge that he lived. Yet she loved each cold chill that told her it was true. Outside, the dogs began fighting over the rations, and a teak whip cracked like a gunshot. Miak shivered at the sound. The thought of Amarok and tears welled up in her eyes, but she did not fall, for she was headed, also thinking about Capuchin. She must find him. He would save the wolves just as he had saved the people of Kangeek. Amarok, Amarok, she sang as she fluffed up her furs. Uma turned to her in surprise. You are happy after all, she said in Eskimo. I thought perhaps this was the beginning of your periods and that your family had sent you to hunt and be to a hut to be alone. The old grandmother who raised me did that, and I was miserable and so unhappy because no one does that anymore. Miak shook her head. I am not yet a woman. Uma did not inquire further, but hugged her. Then she put away her baby in her cuspuk and crept out to join Atik in the starlit darkness. It was day, and the constellations of the southern hemisphere were shining overhead. The dogs were biting their harnesses and fighting with each other, and Atik was trying to make them hold still. Suddenly they lunged in all directions and the sled was moving. Atik picked up Uma and the baby, put them on the sled, and calling his grateful thanks to Miax, took off. She waved until they were lost in the darkness, then rushed into the house, rolled up her sleeping skins and loaded her sled. She hoisted her pack to her back and picked up Tornate. Carefully, she slipped the feather coat around his breast and leaving his wings free, tied the little coat on his back. He looked silly. She laughed, rubbed her nose against his beak, and then tucked him into the hood of her parka. Anama, aya, aya, anama, she sang as she slid to the river, put on her snowshoes, and strode down the snapping ice bed. She had gone about a mile when she heard Kapu bark. She knew it was he. His voice was unmistakable. Terrified, she turned around. Stay, stay, she screamed. The wind picked up her words and blew them down the river. Kapu ran up to her, followed by Nails and the pups. All were yipping authoritatively as they told her to join them. I cannot, she cried. My own Amarok lives. I must go to him. She waited for a few steps and turned and glared as the wolf leader had done. For a moment they hesitated, as if not believing her message. Then they dashed away and ran up the river. They called from the bank, and then they were gone. Miax had spoken her last words to her wolves. She thought of Capuchin and hurried on. What could she say? Would she say to him? Would they rub noses when they met? Surely he would hug his favorite child and let her enter his house, tan his hide, sew his clothes, cook his food. There was so much she could do for this great hunter now. Prepare caribou, catch rabbits, pluck birds, and even make tools with water and freezing air. She would be very useful to him, and with the cold, and they would live with the cold and the birds and the beasts. She tried to recall Capugin's face, his dark eyes, and the brows that drooped kindly. Would his cheeks still be strong and creased with laughter? Would he have long hair and stand tall? A green fountain of magnetic light shone up the sky, its edges rimmed with sparks. The air crackled, the river groaned, and Miax pointed her boots towards Capuchin. Here's a picture of her running along heading her sights towards her father. She could see the village of Cangeek long before she got to it. Its lights twinkled in the winter night on the first bench of the river near the sea. When she could make out windows and the dark outlines of houses, she pulled up her sled to the second bench of the river and stopped. She needed to think before meeting Capuchin. She pitched her tent, spread out her sleeping skins. Lying on her stomach, she peered down on the town. It consisted of about 50 wooden houses. A few were large, but all had the same rectangle design and were with peaked roofs, with peaked roof. Cangleek was so snowy she could not see if there was trash in the streets, but even if there had been, she would not have even cared. Capugin's home had to be beautiful. The village had cross, excuse me. The village had one crossroad where the church and mission stood. On the other side of them were the stores, which Miax recognized by the many people who wandered in and out. He listened. Dog teams barked from both ends of the town, and although they were now snowmobiles, the village was essentially a sled-down, old-fashioned Eskimo settlement. That pleased her. Her eyes roamed the street. A few children were out romping in the snow, and she guessed that it was about 10 in the morning, the time when Eskimo children were sent out to play. By that hour, their mothers had completed the morning chores and had time to dress the little ones and sent them outside, cold as it was. Below the town, she could see the musk oxen, whom it had spoken about. They were circled together near the gate of their enclosure, heads facing out to protect themselves from wolves and bears. Her heart thrilled to see the wondrous oxen of the north. She could help Capuchin take care of the herd. Two children burst out of a house, put a board across a barrel like a seesaw, and took their positions standing on either end of the board. They began jumping, sending each other higher and higher, coming down on the board with incredible accuracy. Miax had seen this game in Barrow, and she watched the flying figures with fascination. Then she slowly lifted her eyes and concentrated on the houses. There were two green houses near the wilderness. She was debating which one was Capugin's when the door opened and the smaller one and three children tumbled out. She decided he must live in the other, with the windows, the annex, two wooden boats in the yard. A woman came out of Capugin's house and hurried across the snow. Oh, of course, Miax thought. He has married. He had someone to sew and cook for him, but I can still help him with the oxen. The woman passed the church and stopped at the mission door. She was engulfed in light for an instant, then the door closed behind her. Miax arose. It was time to speak to her father. He would be alone. Her feet skimmed the snow as she ran down the hill and across the road where the children were hitching a dog to a sled. They giggled, and Tornate answered their high bird-like voices from inside her hood. As Miax neared the greenhouse, she took Tornate in her hands and ran right up to the door. She knocked. Footsteps sounded from a far corner of the house. The door opened, and there stood Capuchin. He was just as she remembered, rugged, but with dark, gentle eyes. Not a word came to her mind, not even her name or a greeting. She was too moved by the sight of him to speak. Then Tornate peeped. She held him out. I have a present for you, she said at last in Eskimo. The feathered coat rustled, and Tornate's amber head pulled into the covering like a little turtle. What is it? Capugin's voice was resonant and warm and seemed to come from the seashore of Nunavut, where the birds sang, and the sea framed the fur of his parka. Come in. I've never seen such a bird. He spoke English, and she smiled and shook her head. He repeated his invitation in Upik. Miak stepped across the threshold and into his home. The big room was warm and smelled of skins and fat. Harpoons hung on the wall, and under the window was a long couch of furs. The kayak hung from the ceiling, and a little stove glowed in the center of the room. Capugin's house in Kangik looked just like Capugin's house in Seal Camp. She was home. Tornate hopped to the floor, his feather coat blooming behind him like a courting ptarmigan. He ran under a fir. He wears a coat, Capuchin laughed and got down on his knees to peer at the bird. Yes, Miak said, he is the spirit of the birds. He is a golden plover. A golden plover? The spirit of the birds? Where did you hear that? Capuchin arose and pushed back her parka hood. Who are you? Julie Edwards Miaks Capuchin. The great frost-blackened hands ran softly over her face. Eli, she whispered. Yes, you are she. You are beautiful like your mother. He opened his arms. She ran into them, and for a long time he held her tightly. When they sent you to school, he said softly, Nunavak was too much to bear. I left and began a new life. Last year, at last I was rich, I went back to get you, but you were gone. His fingers touched her hair, and he hugged her once more. The door opened, and the woman came in. Who do we have here? She asked in English. Miak saw her face was pale, and her hair was reddish gold. A chill spread over her. What had Capuchin done? What had happened to him that he would marry a Gusak? Was this what was his new life? Capuchin and his woman talked, she loudly, Capuchin quietly. Miak's eyes went around the room again. This time she saw not just furs and kayak, but an electric lamp, a radio phonograph, cotton curtains, and through the door to the annex, the edge of an electric stove, a coffee pot, china dishes. There were bookshelves and a framed picture of the wall of some American country garden. Then she saw a helmet and goggles on a chair. Miak stared at them until Capuchin noticed her. Ah, that, he said. I now own an airplane, Miaks. It's the only way to hunt today. The whales are scarce, the seals are scarce, and the whales are almost gone. But sportsmen can still hunt from planes. Miaks heard no more. It could not be. It could not be. She would not let it be. She instantly buried what she was thinking in the shadows of her mind. Miaks, the wolf said in bad Upik, I teach in the school here. We shall enroll you tomorrow. You can learn to read and write English. It's very difficult to live, even in this Eskimo town, without knowing English. Miaks looked at Capuchin. I'm on my way to San Francisco, she said softly in Upik. The Guseks and Wainwright have arranged transportation for me. I shall go tomorrow. A telephone rang. Capuchin answered it and jotted down a note. I'll be right back, he said to Miax. I'll be right back, then we'll talk. He hugged her. Miax stiffened and looked at the helmet. Ellen, fix her some food, he called as he put on his coat, a long American Arctic field jacket. He zipped it with a flourish and went out the door. Ellen went into the kitchen, and Miax was alone. Slowly she picked up Tornate, put on her sealskin parka, and placed the little bird in her hood. Then she snapped on the radio, and as it crackled, whined, and picked up music, she opened the door and softly closed it behind her. Capuchin, after all, was dead to her. On the second bench of the river above the town, she found her tent and pack, threw them onto her sled, and bending forward, hauled on it. She walked up the river toward her house. She was an Eskimo, and as an Eskimo she must live. The hour of the lemming was upon the land, cycling toward the hour of Miax. She would build snow houses in winter, a sod house in the summer. She would carve and sew and trap. And someday there would be a boy like her. They would raise children who would live with the rhythm of the beasts and the land. The seals are scarce and the whales are almost gone, she heard Capuchin say. When are you coming to live with us in San Francisco? Called Amy. Miax walked backward, watching the river valley. When the last light of Cangeek disappeared, the stars lit the snow, and the cold deepened far below zero. The ice thundered and boomed, roaring like drumbeats across the Arctic. Tornate peeped. Miax turned his head, touched him with her chin, and felt his limpness. She stopped walking and lifted him into the cold. Tornate, what is wrong with you? Are you sick? Swiftly opening her pack, she took out some meat, chewed on it, and gave it to the bird. He refused to eat. She put him inside her parka, pitched her tent out of the wind. When she had banked it with snow, she lit a small fire. The tent glowed, then warmed. Tornate lay in her hands, his head on her fingers. He peeped softly and closed his eyes. Many hours later, she buried him in the snow. The toad of Amarok was in her pocket. Her fingers ran over it, but she did not take it out. She sang to the spirit of Amarok in her best English. The seals are scarce and the whales are almost gone. The spirits of the animals are passing away. Amarok, Amarok, you are my adopted father. My feet dance because of you. My eyes see because of you. My mind thinks because of you, and thinks on this thundering night that the hour of the wolf and the Eskimo is over. Julie pointed her boots towards Capuchin. Okay, boys and girls, there's the end. And we'll certainly talk and Zoom about it because there's a lot there to think about. A lot of emotion, a lot of emotional ups and downs. And Julie pointed her boots towards Capuchin. Okay, so I'll speak with you soon. Bye-bye. Bye again.